everything is good to go and you can hear, etc.
Yep, good to go. All good.
Right, fantastic. Well, hello everybody, and welcome to today. A couple of days ago, I was talking to one of the original delegates from a program that I ran in Afrika Tikkun. The program was looking at advanced application workshops, and the person I was speaking to shared one of her memories. And the first memory that came to her was the following. She said to me, I remember being there on the first day, and I remember that everybody else seemed to be getting what you were saying, but not me, I was lost. And I took a couple of things away from that. The first is that, frankly, if she was the only one who was lost in the room, then I'm winning, right? Because I only go for like 50%. If half of the people are following what I'm saying, then I think I'm doing well. The second thing, Dr. Jean Elphick, is I guarantee you weren't the only one in the room who was lost. There were lots of people who were lost at the beginning of the program. It was only by the end of the program that I think we were all found. So welcome to this webinar. Today, hopefully we will get more than a 50% hit rate of people who understand, mostly because we are going to let other people do the talking a lot of the time. The title of the webinar is Insights from Within an Organization That Keeps Getting It Right. To be clear, the webinar was titled by us. This isn't Afrika Tikkun tooting their own trumpet, but it is a title that is absolutely sincere, and I thank Afrika Tikkun sincerely for participating. We are privileged today to be joined by Marc Lubner. Marc is the Group CEO at Afrika Tikkun and has been an integral part of this process. We are also joined by Leonie van Tonder, who for much of the last 7 years that we're going to be talking about has been the COO, or was the COO at Afrika Tikkun. Hello, Leonie.
Hello.
And we've also been joined by Nehwoh Belinda. And Nehwoh and I worked quite closely together. Nehwoh is responsible for the Utando Center at Afrika Tikkun, and is here to give us a sense from on the ground of how things have been and what has really made a difference. We are also honored to be joined today by Anne Harris, and Anne was in fact one of the co-founders of Afrika Tikkun, and I just wanted to mention that Anne has joined us because of the amazing work that Afrika Tikkun has done, and I think we all owe a debt of gratitude to people like Anne, so thank you. Right, I'm going to start by giving a brief overview or a brief introduction to Afrika Tikkun as a group, and then also telling the story of legitimate leadership with Afrika Tikkun. I will then ask a few questions of Marc, Leonie, and Nehwoh, which I hope will unearth some really valuable and interesting insights. And I invite you all to share your questions through the chat or by raising your virtual hands to ask any questions that you have. I don't think we often have such a wealth of knowledge into which we can tap to really understand how we can really make a difference. We will be recording the session today, and we will be distributing the recording afterwards. Right. So Dave, if I could ask you to please bring up the slide with some information about Afrika Tikkun. Afrika Tikkun is in fact a group of organizations. There's the Afrika Tikkun non-profit company, there's the Afrika Tikkun Services, and also Afrika Tikkun Investments. Afrika Tikkun is one of the largest non-profits in South Africa and does incredible work with children, really from cradle to career, and also young adults. They operate from 5 centers, 4 of those in Gauteng and 1 in the Western Cape, and have impacted, we looked at the numbers, have impacted more than 36,000 children since being involved with legitimate leadership in 2013. And as Leonie and I were discussing earlier, that is the children who have been directly impacted by being registered at the centers. Afrika Tikkun also runs outreach programs and goes to schools, etc. And the number of children impacted is in fact far greater even than the 36,000. So, you know, quite a staggering number. We originally got involved with Afrika Tikkun in around about 2013, and after Afrika Tikkun had run an engagement survey, and the engagement survey results came back at around about 27% of people engaged. And Dave, do you mind pulling the slide down just so I can see everyone? Afrika Tikkun, when we first started working there, was characterized as an organization which was quite chaotic on the ground. It had experienced significant growth over a long time. Marc was describing to me earlier how you know, they had really wanted to be moving much more quickly than they were, and that had certain implications for the growth, etc., of the organization and the culture. Management disciplines on the ground were fairly lacking. There had been some retrenchments. The vision of the organization wasn't that well understood, and wasn't getting through to all of the new people in the organization. Managers weren't available to their people, and you know, the organization knew that something needed to change. So amongst other things, they engaged, or Afrika Tikkun engaged, legitimate leadership. And I'm very pleased to say within a short space of 1 year, the engagement survey results went from 27% engaged to 59% engaged. Now, what that means is that at the start, if there are 3 people talking at a water cooler, 2 of them are talking the organization down and 1 of them is talking it up. By the end of that year, 2 people at that water cooler were talking the organization up and 1 of them was talking it down. And if you've ever been in organizations like that, it's chalk and cheese between those 2 situations. In fact, the engagement survey was run by an organization which was not us, by an independent business, which in fact got hold of us afterwards, because they said to me, we have just not seen this kind of turnaround in such a short space of time. And in fact, the person who was responsible for running that survey in Afrika Tikkun even joined me on a 2-day open program and sat for 2 days to find out about the legitimate leadership model and what we'd done because of the impact that he had seen in that business. So that was remarkable, but perhaps even more remarkable than that was the fact that it has sustained. Anyone involved in large-scale change programs will know that it's one thing to change an organization. It's a whole different story for an organization to, or for that change and that positive shift to endure over a period as long as 7 years, and it isn't slowing down yet. So we are going to be exploring what has enabled this service to the community through the leadership, through the way that Afrika Tikkun is to endure for such a long time. The last part of the story is due to COVID and lockdown and this crazy year that we've had. Afrika Tikkun was able to pivot, and they shifted during lockdown from being an organization which supported center registered families to an organization which supported the broader community, which was able to move out of the classroom and into serving meals, into distributing food parcels, into a space where they were able to execute social services interventions in the community. And for me, that is part of what has just been so unbelievable. You know, there are lots of organizations that struggle to turn the ship around, struggle to make a shift, and Afrika Tikkun did this in a matter of weeks, got people to commit to a whole new way of doing things and a whole new reason for being on a daily basis. So I think this is an amazing story. I'm very excited to have everyone on the call. I'm also very confident that you didn't dial in to listen to me. So I am going to bring Marc and Leonie and Nehwoh into the conversation. And I'm going to start off with a question for Marc. And the question, Marc, is this. What was Afrika Tikkun like before legitimate leadership, and what triggered you to adopt LL as a way of leading in your organization?
And first and foremost, thank you for spotlighting Afrika Tikkun today. And I think Afrika Tikkun should not be spotlighted as an organization per se, but rather as an interesting case study of an organization which grew very, very quickly. We changed our primary focus around ad hoc programs to sort of this integrated cradle to career approach. And whilst we sitting at head office might have had a clear understanding of what we wanted to achieve, I don't think we communicated it particularly well to the people who were going to be responsible for the implementation. And that was creating a lot of confusion. In particular, this growing rift between head office and the operating sites. So there was a lot of information that was lost in interpretation, quite honestly. The second element was that you had a board who were comprised of people who pretty much came from, the commercial world exclusively, and didn't necessarily understand the change processes that would be required. When you're in the developmental space, you've almost got to turn the pyramid of responsibility on its head. And you've got to realize that it's the people at the coalface who are in fact your most important assets, not necessarily the size of your balance sheet or the people who are sitting at head office. The third element was that there was no innovation coming from the sites themselves, which was quite peculiar to me. You would have anticipated that people now empowered to be able to bring about change really within the township environments, coming from those very communities, would be pushing management to bring about various programs to bring about change. And we were sorely lacking in that innovation. The fourth element was, frankly speaking, I personally was really exhausted. I was really burnt out. And I went for a walk one day on the beach with Wendy Lucas Bull, who I think is well known to most of the listeners dialing in today. And she recommended that I meet this extraordinary woman, Leonie van Tonder, who would in fact be the genie in the bottle that would provide all the solutions that we were looking for. And in fact, that turned out to be very much the case. When I first met with Leonie, Leonie explained to me that she had come from a corporate background, but she had a deep sense and understanding of how to make people feel valued, how to make people feel respected. And the request that I had to Leonie was, help, I need a new culture within the organization to enable us to be effective on one hand, to be able to bring about the changes that I felt were so necessary, but most importantly, to make people feel that they really mattered, and not necessarily just the work that they did, but they themselves really necessarily mattered. So that was the background in 2013, against which we were fortunate to meet with Leonie, and Leonie was insistent that legitimate leadership was in fact the way to go. And in fact, I think she made her employment within the organization conditional on us, supporting her with this process. And we've never looked back.
Ian, we've lost your sound.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, I have been told by Leonie a few times that she made her initial engagement with Afrika Tikkun contingent on bringing in legitimate leadership. But I've never had it confirmed, Marc, that this was in fact one of her one of her conditions of employment.
If I may,
You know, I go for 25 days leave. Leonie goes for legitimate leadership must be a part of it.
Can I, quickly, if I may be given the indulgence, in my very first interview with Leonie, she walked into the office and said to me, listen, Mark, I need to explain two things to you before you make any job offers to me. Number one, I don't hug trees. Number two, I don't particularly like children. I thought, here's a woman who's coming to work in a non-for-profit child development organization. She's got what we call chutzpah. And I thought to myself, my gosh, she's got to have something really special then to offer if she can't offer at least a passion for that. Frankly speaking, within a matter of weeks, I actually saw that that was not the case at all. You know, she had an incredible passion for people. But I think what she brought with the legitimate leadership background was the sense that if you're going to care for people, you've got to do so responsibly. And that, I think, has been probably the starting point that helped us to understand what legitimate leadership was really all about.
Right. Yeah. Mark, I can also tell you that Leonie, during the lockdown, did some work with my wife to supply some PPE to the hospital where my wife's working. And Leonie would come around to visit. And despite her also telling me that she doesn't like children, she used to bring gifts for my children. So, yeah, we don't take everything Leonie says too seriously. On that note, though, Leonie, I'd like to shift the question to you. Based on your experience at Afrika Tikkun and elsewhere, what advice would you give to people on the call who are thinking of starting an implementation in legitimate leadership or in a new part of their organization? I mean, what is important to take into account before you start, and what is important to take into account as you move through an implementation?
Yeah, that bit of the conversation sounded like an obituary, but I won't take it personally. I think that one of the most important things that one needs to do firstly is to look at the structure of the organization. If there's no clarity in the structure, it is very difficult for people to understand who they take their orders from. And that one must obviously be quite stringent about the line of command. Secondly, to get the buy-in from senior management is absolutely critical. What we did at Afrika Tikkun is, when we started with the legitimate leadership rollout, we started with the exco or with the senior management. There wasn't really an exco at that stage. But we started with the senior management and we did it in the layers of the organization. And it is extremely important to never ever forget the non-managerial people, because you cannot institute a change in your culture as well as in your management process and activities if you do not take everybody into consideration. What is so nice about the legitimate leadership program is that the development is in the managerial groups, and that there are also programs that go right down to the real people in the organization, for them to understand why they are there, and for them to really also understand, and everybody else to appreciate the unique contribution that each and every person makes to any organization.
Yeah. Leonie, you talk about contribution, and one thing that sits with me is we're talking about an NGO here, and we're talking about Afrika Tikkun, and surely everyone who works at Afrika Tikkun is naturally just a fantastic person who wants to make a contribution. So surely this is just much easier to do in Afrika Tikkun than it ever would have been to do, for instance, in a bank.
Yeah, you might think so, but the fact of the matter is that people need, when you care for other people, like Afrika Tikkun staff care for the children, you need to also put that care in context. And care also has accountability. Care is not a bunny hugging process anyway. It has responsibility, and it certainly also has accountability. It is not more easier or more difficult to do it in NGO than what it is to do it in a commercial company. People need to understand the responsibility and accountability that goes with caring for people.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, in some ways, I've done some work, obviously, with Afrika Tikkun and also with another not-for-profit organization in Africa. And in some ways, the profit motive almost makes it easier, I think, because people are less confused about what they're expected to do and what the kind of purpose is. Nehwoh, if I can shift the conversation to you, I remember having a discussion several years ago about how people in the room with us, our job was not in fact to enable children. Our job was to enable adults and enable people managing the centers. And I think that was a very difficult thing for some people to come to terms with. The contribution that the center heads had to make was not in fact to children directly, it was indirectly through the other leaders. But share with us, how did you experience the shift on the ground? And what do you think made that shift stick for the last 7 years?
Thank you very much, Ian. The philosophy of legitimate leadership has actually grown me as a leader, and it's something that I will definitely recommend to every organization. When legitimate leadership was introduced in the organization, it was a little bit confusing at the beginning because the organization was focusing on results. So when we went to work, it was the results that we are looking for. And contribution was something that we actually did not very much understand. The vision was not very clear, and we were just looking for numbers at a certain time. But when the philosophy of legitimate leadership came in as a leader, I got to know that care was the most important thing, attention. I had to take care and actually grow my people, and the results would just come. So for us to accept that, it was a little bit challenging because we were used to doing things the way we have to do it. But the moment we accepted it, as Leonie said, you need to start from management. As management, the moment we accepted it and transition into implementing what we had learned and what we went through coaching also, 10 months of coaching, 1 day a month. And that coaching was not just talking about theory. Ian, you took us through processes where we discussed issues that were real in the organization. You got us to understand that for people to believe in what you are saying or what the organization is, you have to believe in it. So as a leader, I had to walk the talk. I had to watch the game. I had to let everyone, all my team, know my intent so that I could actually hold people accountable, be it praising them or actually censuring them, and knowing that at the end, they will actually acknowledge it. And making sure that everyone in the organization was on the same page, from the cleaner, whose job is very important, to the cook, to the gardener, made things very easy because the language of the organizations changed immediately. When you praise someone, there was a time they would say that is care and growth. I had a situation where I actually censure someone. At the end of it, that manager thanked me and said, that is care and growth. And so the experience has been great, but consistency is very important, because since we started this process, we have been going through every year. There is a session where we come back and actually get to share and learn again. Thank you.
Yeah. Now, a question on the chat. What do you mean by caring responsibly, and what were some of the obstacles and challenges that you had to overcome in making the shift to legitimate leadership and to legitimacy and to focusing? How does one shift from a total focus on results to focusing on the things that produce the results?
Okay, so one of the things that I did was I had my one-on-one sessions, which were well planned. They were not just in the air. So you have dates in the diary, and I made sure that I met with my managers when it was the day to meet with them. And in that meeting, I actually gave them the responsibility. They actually own the meeting. So they are the ones that actually direct the meeting. If they had to talk about their personal issues, I have to listen to them, because I had to open up and just be there and make sure that I listen and listen carefully. Many times someone comes into the office late or something happens and we don't even know the background of the person. We don't even know them as a person. We just need them to produce, to work, be happy in the morning, and make sure children are happy in the classroom also. When I started having those one-on-ones and actually incrementally suspending control on certain things, making them take decisions, and whether I love the decisions or not, actually letting them run their various departments, the shift, it was clear that I could actually take a holiday and not worry about the center.
Right. So interesting. I was with a client yesterday in the Western Cape, and I asked people in the room, senior management, what would they see as, or how would they know that this program is successful? And two of the people in the room said, I'll know this is successful if I can go on holiday. Mm. And you make the same point that to link into what Marc is saying here, when we control people, we perpetuate dependency. Mm. And maybe, Marc, if I can please draw you into the conversation, what do you mean when you say it means you cannot perpetuate dependency, but rather need to empower?
Well, in the first instance, the world of charity was relatively built on people who wanted to give to people who didn't have. So there was almost this assumption that, you, the giver, were somewhat, superior to the receiver. That kind of mindset, I'm pleased to say, is becoming archaic, because that perpetuates dependency. I will feed you today, and then tomorrow I'm still responsible for feeding you. I haven't taught you necessarily to feed yourself. So the philosophy, in fact, changed within Afrika Tikkun to one that we determined today to be a value of ours, responsible kindness. It's important, obviously, if you're going to be in service of others, you have to be kind. In your nature, your objective has to be kind, but to do so in a manner that is responsible, i.e. that you break that dependency cycle. Now, that's not just necessarily between an organization and its beneficiaries. That's within the organization as well, as Nehwoh was alluding to. One has to necessarily accept that the people that are working with you in the organization have insight, have skills, got involved in this particular field because this is what they really want to do. So it's no good just simply taking people and putting them into predefined jobs whose results are measured purely and simply on the prescribed outcomes. You have to recognize that these are individuals who are putting their heart and soul into the type of work that they're doing. So to employ responsibly means to recognize and to build systems that enable individuals to be able to speak their minds, innovate, and you've got to encourage that kind of behavior and incentivize that kind of behavior rather than simply just putting people into process flows.
Right. Mark, one of the analogies we use is that if you want to have a beautiful garden, you not only need to plant a beautiful garden and water it and look after the growth phase, but you also need to tend to that garden if you want it to stay beautiful. What has been required from you, and Leonie, I'm going to ask you this question also, but what is required from the leader in order to sustain a way of leading, a philosophy, if you like, in an organization? I mean, is this something that requires energy? Is this something that requires deliberate focus? Or is it something which just happens because you have a fundamental belief?
No, and most definitively, like anything and everything, that's worthwhile in life, you've got to work at it. And the more you work at something, the better it necessarily becomes invariably, with obviously sensitivities. I think what kind of as I found with legitimate leadership is that this commitment to constant improvement, to rigorous improvement, is not something I've necessarily had to give up on. This isn't a situation where leadership in the organization simply turn around and sit back and say, oh, well, great, now my staff are empowered. In fact, if anything, it changes the role of the leader in the organization to become even more of a visionary, more strategic. Your responsibility to your team, becomes in fact even greater because people are now doing what they're saying they're going to do, and therefore they have expectations of you to be able to also fulfill your role. So just very quickly, a response to you is to say that there is an absolute necessity for commitment to constantly reviewing this process, constantly refreshing this process, and not allowing it to simply lapse. This isn't a 1 hour fitness video experience. This is something you have to learn to live, and the more you live it, the more necessarily it becomes real in every element, from HR to leadership disciplines, to the talk within the organization. You talk about those people around the water fountain. The nature of the talk has changed around those water fountains. We now talk legitimate leadership lingo and have a deep sense and understanding, commitment to what that really means. So it is a rigorous commitment to an ongoing structured process and an adoption of a number of informal procedures within the organization.
Right. Mark, is this something that you can outsource?
You can outsource the teachings, but this is a situation where your own in-house trainers have to be trained, and then they themselves train others. So each of our, for argument's sake, general managers themselves become teachers in their own right. So they got trained, and then they were able to themselves train others. So it really is a process that infuses throughout the organization. You cannot necessarily, as I say, buy a video or employ a Leonie van Tonder for just 1 day a month and leave it at that. You have to recognize that what you're doing is you're injecting this throughout the entire body of the organization.
Yeah.
And by the way, so I make the point, you have to rely though on experts, frankly speaking, like yourselves, Ian and Leonie, to help advise us as to changes that are taking place, because it's dynamic, right? So it's if I want to heal myself, I know that as a patient, for argument's sake, with a doctor, I've got to take advice constantly from a doctor. I've got to keep checking in with the doctor, but ultimately it's up to me to heal myself. But equally, I'm not going to know what changes to implement unless I go back to those specialists continuously from time to time. So it's a good question that, is this something you can outsource? I don't think it's something you can do internally on your own without guidance. And equally, I don't think it's something you can necessarily just delegate to third parties to give effect to.
Right. Yeah, thanks, Mark. I mean, I think the way that we like to think of, certainly I like to think about it, is as a partnership. And you know, I was personally in partnership with Wendy, my now colleague. But when I was in a business trying to implement this framework, I absolutely saw Wendy as a partner in that implementation, and also someone I could enjoy a glass of wine with. You know, but important things. A question for you, Leonie. You know, you've been involved in successful implementations of care and growth in different organizations. What were the particular challenges in Afrika Tikkun, and how were they overcome? This is from the chat.
As an NGO, the very relevant challenge was obviously money. And I think the second challenge is time. And the third one in Afrika Tikkun was logistics. As far as the money goes, Marc found us some money to actually do this, and going forward through the other years, there was special donations made specifically, and Harris was one of the people who also supported us greatly as far as that's concerned. As far as time goes, one must obviously always take people's time into consideration, because there are children and beneficiaries that actually demand their time and needs to be attended to. So the organization of the time was important. And then in an organization who have different branches, like a bank has different branches, Tikkun has different branches. What we did there is something actually which, looking back on it, proved to be one of the best things we did, is we actually selected in the groups that attended the workshops, we actually selected people from different centers and brought them together at a central venue. And for the first time, people actually got to know their colleagues that do the same kind of work in a different center. And there is no doubt in my mind, and I'm sure Marc will confirm this, that just bringing the people together for that purpose made a huge difference in the organization, because people suddenly started to get to know their colleagues that were spread over the breadth and width of Johannesburg, and actually saw that they all had the same kind of challenges in the organization.
Yeah. Leonie, thank you. Another question from Ursula. What type of coaching is recommended? And maybe I can put this forward to you, Leonie. What kind of coaching did you do with people in the organization? Was it external, internal? Was it you sitting with others?
No, the coaching which was mentioned was specifically around the application modules of legitimate leadership that we did, which are in pointing to specific aspects of the work, things like true meaning of care, performance management, empowerment. When we did those theoretical days or half days, we took the people, they got some homework, and they had to go and practice this in the centers, and then before the next session, we actually sat with them. They shared their experiences with us, and this became sort of learning from your peers, because the one person had a better way of solving a problem than another, and people learn from each other in these reviews and coaching sessions where there were specific problems. Obviously, I stepped in and I did that myself.
Right. Thank you, Leonie. And a question from Nick, and I'm going to pose this initially to you, Leonie, and then I'm going to ask Mark if you can please share your insights as well. But did you have any managers that didn't see themselves as leaders? I've certainly come across people who've said, look, I'm a manager and my job is to deliver results. And frankly, I don't care about people and I don't care about you and your program either. You know, what does, how do you respond to that? I mean, was that the case at Afrika Tikkun?
Yeah, without saying, yeah, that's how do I answer this very diplomatically? Yes, we did, and what was the best to do was to give the person, and that's what we did, give the person the best opportunity and best guidance that we possibly could. And then at a moment in time, decided, listen, this is not working. Have a good conversation and redeploy the person somewhere else where they would be much better suited. This in opposition of a hospital pass, which one should never do. But yes, we had some people, but they were successfully redeployed into different positions, maybe with a lower rank, but where they were responsible for functions and not necessarily for people directly.
Right. Thanks, Leonie. And Mark, what is your view on that question?
Yeah, you know, it's a great question, and from our point of view, you know, the organization was always driven by values. If the original founders, if you look to the people themselves, Anne Harris, who I know is listening in today, her late husband, you know, the legendary, you know, Chief Rabbi Harris, and my late father, the organization's principles were always values driven. So it wasn't too difficult when we started to implement a cultural program, a values driven cultural program, to say it's not negotiable, you know. And as to Leonie's point, rather than creating fear and trepidation, the system of legitimate leadership and the way it was implemented, it became obvious to certain individuals who suddenly realized, not suddenly, but over the period of the process, said, you know what, this isn't really comfortable for me. This isn't the environment that I really want to be in. And because we said the cultural shift is non-negotiable, legitimate leadership is not necessarily a characteristic approach. It's a way of following values from people around you. And you would either ascribe to those values or it became obvious that you weren't going to fit. And in fact, people left. And we didn't go and have, you know, CCMA hearings and things like that. It was, in fact, as Leonie, you know, so adequately, you know, appropriately said, a proper discussion was held and people necessarily moved on, either into other posts where they weren't necessarily in leadership positions or out of the organization completely.
I think it's...
I want to just make one more point, sorry, a very important point, if I may. What really impressed me, and this is what I woke up to, frankly speaking, in realizing my own limitations, was the capacity that the management team had to embrace and support one another. Was remarkable. It was absolutely remarkable. And if there's one sort of take home that will take with me always, is how the management team work together, bringing their various different strengths and relative weaknesses to support one another and create this really magnificent team of individuals capable of achieving so much.
Yeah. Mark, I think what you're saying is important, and I have seen many leaders over the years who want to have their cake and eat it, I think is the expression. They want to be values and principles driven, but they also just can't bring themselves to give up on the short-term result. And it does become fundamentally, disabling, because people see that as insincere. You can't claim to be values driven and at the same time, when push comes to shove, you don't act in a values driven way. And I think that it's hard for people to, or for leaders to make that kind of sacrifice. But in the long run, it's not even a sacrifice, right?
And you know, the interesting thing was, you know, again, and forgive me if this is sounding too personal, you know, I thought here I was, this caring, loving, all-embracing, wonderful human being who was, you know, so supportive of my staff. And then when I looked at the percentage of those who were engaged, this is prior to us investing in legitimate leadership. And then I had, you know, Leonie, this tough talking, no nonsense individual who was going to come on board and take over the role of chief operating officer and implement legitimate leadership as part of that. You know, I must be honest, I had to swallow real hard because I thought to myself, I'm going to alienate everybody by bringing in this style of leadership. And in fact, quite the reverse, in fact, happened. Because I was, and my role was more clearly defined through the legitimate leadership process, because each individual understood that they mattered and the values that we were instituting in the organization. If anything, there was a greater sense of security that everybody had, because they knew which direction they were going, and they knew how they fitted into the overall puzzle. And equally, they knew where my role's boundaries, you know, began and ended, which is very, very important. So people didn't think, well, because Marc is the CEO, he can pretty much just do anything and everything he wants. And, you know, there were protocols that were implemented, which were good for me, good for the organization, and I think brought a far better sense of trust between ourselves, which is a very important ingredient in running any organization.
Yeah. Again, you know, you can't have your cake and eat it. You can't have total control and total autonomy and do whatever you like and also be trusted. I think that's you know, key for people to reflect on. I wanted to bring the last part of the story, the lockdown part of the story, into a little bit of relief, and I wanted to combine that with a question that Wendy has put on the chat for Nehwoh. And Nehwoh, you know, as a general manager specifically, you know, Wendy's question is, what have you done to keep this alive? And in answering that, please can you just rope in something of an understanding of how at your center legitimate leadership enabled you to make this shift from, you know, we're here in classrooms looking after children and young adults and registered families, to we are making a massive contribution to the community. You know, this is something that not everyone has been able to do. So Nehwoh, how have you managed to keep things going on the ground, and how has this helped to do things differently for the last year?
Thank you very much for the question. I think St. Francis of Assisi once said, preach the gospel. If necessary, use words. I try and live by that. So I make sure that I live by the legitimate leadership principles. Sometimes they're not very easy to do, but I try and remind myself. So one of the things I do is I respect and support staff members. I listen to them. The other thing is I do not promise something, or I do not ask for an opinion from a staff member or from the management team for something that I will not follow up and make sure it happens, or actually close it with them. The other thing that I try and do to live by this principle is I've learned how to give feedback and not mixing things. So if someone does something very well, I'll actually appreciate them. I will not in one sentence say, or if you did not do something well, I'll tell you, I'm disappointed by this. I will not say, you are always good at doing this, but today that. So I try not to give mixed messages. I try to stick to the right thing. If I'm praising someone, I praise them. If I have to give them tough feedback, then I give this feedback. And in that process, both of us grow. Also, during the lockdown, we as the organization, everyone had understood what contribution means. And so when management decided within a week to say we are going to distribute food parcels, we have to go in the communities. One great thing they did was each center manager had to manage their center in a way that speaks to the community, because you can't dictate. As much as we actually knew that people wanted food parcels, we still had to do it in a way that is dignified. So we got in, called staff members, said this is the decision, and everyone was in. And we actually had to put people in different groups. There were people who had to cook to distribute the meal and everything. But as the culture of the organization holds, we communicate with each other. In the process of checking in with the team, they told me honestly, because we had built a relationship where people can openly say, hold us accountable as managers also. So they said, we know we are doing this work. We are happy doing this work, but we feel like we were not consulted. And openly, I had to say it was a crisis. And in times of crisis, management has to make certain decisions, but we acknowledge the fact that you came in and we actually did the work. We had to go out in the community, give food parcels despite the difficulties, the challenges we had with people, many people wanting food parcels and we not having all, we not having food parcels to distribute to everyone. But working with the community in partnership with organizations, it helped the process. So everyone came in and contributed. People don't look at job descriptions at Afrika Tikkun. They go away. They've actually moved out of that and making sure that we serve the communities that we are in.
Right. And Nehwoh, do you think that this has been enabled by having a different approach? I mean, could you not have just said to people, this is what we're going to do, and they must listen? Because again, you know, you've got people who want to make a contribution in the organization.
No, I think I've said the philosophy of legitimate leadership, the care and growth model, the fact that we had to understand the true meaning of care played a great role. Without it, I think we would have just been dictating and we wouldn't have gotten the feedback that we got. People will work, but they will not give it their all. And people will find excuses not to do the work, which was actually, it was COVID-19, it was a pandemic. Everyone was scared. And we had to listen to people. If someone said they were sick, many people could take sick leave, but they did not because they really truly wanted to contribute. And what this had actually been paved by the care and growth that we actually live by in the organization. So without that legitimate leadership, it would have just been people struggling to claim UIF, people struggling to do whatever and not actually giving of themselves.
Right. Yeah, thank you. No, and I mean, you absolutely raised for me, you know, how many organizations do I know of where the conversation became about UIF and TERS and that kind of thing, not about how can we contribute. You know, whole sectors of our society where people just left their posts in a crisis in order to worry about TERS, and that didn't happen at Afrika Tikkun.
And can I just quickly, forgive me if I may, just add one quick comment to it. You know, just to put a context to it.
And I think, Mark, this will also be in summary because we are wrapping up now. So great job.
Just very quickly, I think just put it into context. this wasn't necessarily just people who had asked to be doing different jobs. These were people who were being asked to go into an environment where all of the rules that were supposed to be applied to the pandemic, social distancing, stay at home, were being effectively turned on their head. There were people going into community environments where they were swarmed by others who were necessarily looking at food security as a priority. And these were not staff members who were anticipating overtime payments. And I can tell you the number of hours worked was significantly well in excess of that which they were contracted to. So why did legitimate leadership enable us to actually swing from a structured day-to-day regime to this, a new set of crisis interventions? It was because there was trust. In the time prior to the crisis, trust had been developed between management and staff at all different levels. There was this spirit, and I'm so interested to hear, what Nehwoh just said. Nehwoh said that she, at her level, took decisions because there was a crisis. And she conveyed those decisions, but she was still sensitive to the fact that there hadn't necessarily been a proper sense of caucus and stuff like this. By the way, it's a pretty good lesson that maybe our president might want to give thought to. Maybe he's doing it actually at the moment. In times of crisis, you have to take decisions and you have to be surrounded by people who trust you that you've taken the right decisions and will back and support that. So what legitimate leadership had done in the build-up, and that's why it's so important. You can't just intervene with legitimate leadership as a once-off initiative or a once-a-year sort of initiative. You've got to constantly refresh this. It's got to be a way of life. So that when crisis times do strike, you have the trust amongst all people, from literally teachers who now are simply becoming, packers or delivery staff taking food parcels into the marketplace. I don't know if you saw the numbers, over 100,000 food parcels delivered, monthly supply of food parcels to community members. People taking risks to go out and do that. And they did so because there was a culture within the organization which had been engendered over 7 years and will continue to be so, certainly for as long as I'm involved. And I have no doubt that the team that we've got will continue this process themselves, irrespective. And it's a great way to basically be able to live your life, to wake up each and every single day, going in to a working environment where you're surrounded by people who trust you, and equally you trust in return.
Yeah. Mark, I think people underestimate just the enormous power of trust. And the fact that you don't turn trust on by paying for it. You turn trust on by earning it.
You have to live it.
And living it, doing it over time.
Yeah.
On that note, I thank you, Galina, for sharing your views as well. I saw that in the chat. Really appreciate that. Nehwoh, thank you. You can see from the chat that people are inspired by the work that you have done in the centres. Leonie, as always, inspiring words from you also. Thank you. And I really do encourage anybody who wants to share their thoughts to do so afterwards. We will send out the recording, and please support Afrika Tikkun and support other really worthwhile causes in this time of need in our country. Thank you, Mark. Thanks, everyone. And
thank you so much. And a huge thank you to you, Ian, to Wendy, to Leonie, the entire team, for having had such a dramatic impact, not just on our organization, but on our lives.
Brilliant. Thanks, Mark. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
God bless. Thank you.
Bye.